Hey guys, it's Jonathan, and long time no see. Here's a video. We're in the thick of it for a lot of our goalies, and I apologize for not for those of you who are subscribed to the newsletter. Haven't really sent anything out in a while. Um, I've just kind of been focused on the goalies that we've been working with privately, and to be honest, the start of a new season gets me a little a little bummed out, a little bored. I guess the part of it is that if everybody knew what I felt like they should know, then I wouldn't be doing this, I guess, right? So, but after doing this now for 23 some odd years, uh, I get a little frustrated. So, especially when I hear goalies who are working with coaches who are just like, they're still stuck in the 80s or the 70s. So, anyway, today's topic, uh, as always, these tend to come in bunches for me. I get emails from parents or goalies. This year, a lot of young goalies are reaching out to me. High school goalies, junior high school goalies are reaching out to me directly, which I love. I've often talked mostly to the parents and coaches, and I know there's some people out there that talk, that uh, that talk right to the kids. I find that when I'm one-on-one with kids, it's great, but when I'm mostly working with parents who are working with their goalies, or just kind of overseeing the development of their goalie, kind of goes like that. But recently, I've had three goalies: one a collegiate goalie, one a high school goalie, and one an early high school goalie, so grade nine. Basically, for that goalie, it was a girl kind of who was stepping into a varsity role as a freshman. The other goalie, the other high school goalie was a junior, so grade 11. And then the collegiate goalie was a sophomore, I believe, at a Division two school. And so all of them are experiencing the same issue, which is a sudden fear of the ball, which they didn't have or didn't think that they have. Now, what's really interesting, kind of as I look at the emails here on my screen, is that for the older high school goalie, uh, the grade 11 goalie, this is a goalie who has played with minimal equipment over the years and hasn't really had a fear of the ball, although she makes note of the fact that she sometimes, the word in there is sometimes. Now, for the girl who is going into high school, and listen, if you've got a boy goalie and you're listening to me right now and you're clicking away because I'm talking with the girls right now, you shouldn't. Okay, this applies to everybody. But the idea is this: is that we want the sorry, I'm just looking at my I've got too many screens up here. Okay. For the younger goalie who's making the jump up to the high school, you would think that, hey, all of a sudden there's faster shots, the shots can can sting, and that's to be expected, right? So when we have a goalie who's kind of in transition from like a lower age to a higher age, or rec team to a club team, or that sort of thing, it's kind of like, oh well, this is bound to happen. Okay, so hear me out. For the college goalie though, who is experiencing the same issue, which is like all of a sudden they have this fear of the ball, but they don't really know what caused it. I'm going to talk about a couple topics today that will ring true for some, like right away. For others, it's something to, we're going to talk about some concepts that come into play down the road. And it's not a matter of if, it's usually a matter of when. And if a goalie doesn't experience these things, I believe now those goalies are very lucky. Okay. So for the coaches that are listening to me right now, and you're like an older coach, maybe you're like, you're older than, let's say 50, you're, 50, 60, 65. What I find is a lot of those coaches are, and with all due respect, guys, like seriously, people who come out and say like, oh, I've been coaching for 30 years, have you, or has it been 1 year, 30 times? All right. I try really hard not to be in that role, and to learn and develop and adapt. And I think a lot of coaches get stuck in like they think of like, oh, how it was when they used to play, or they think about the goalies that they knew when they were young, the great goalies, and they think no one compares to those goalies. We got to get away from that. Okay, so here's the thing: couple concepts I want to talk about. First, and you're going to know where I'm going to go with this, but it's protection, but not protection as like you're soft, but protection as a tool. So in field lacrosse especially, we have this culture that, and it's still there. It's not going away, and to be honest, in some places I think it's getting worse. But the idea is that protection is not an admission that you're soft. Protection is a tool. And when you look at other sports and you look at how sports have adapted to be better, okay? So I'll give you a couple. I'll give you a couple examples just that come to the top of my head. Um, I was a field lacrosse goalie, a soccer goalie, an ice hockey goalie, and I was a baseball catcher when I was young. All right, and what I remember back then is that the overall the equipment that we wore was more protective because of the the technology that we had at the time, the plastics, the K-pop, like padding was made out of what was called K-pop, which was basically like a densely woven like wool. Now, for some of you, you'd be like, this sounds like, oh, it was forever ago. It wasn't that long ago, okay? But gloves were made with leather. Now they're made with like synthetics. But the idea that, one of the things that I saw was like in soccer, for example, gloves haven't changed a ton. The technology in the rubber has changed so that they're grippy. However, one thing that I saw a couple of years ago was the design of, in the back of the fingers were these like metal ribs that kept your fingers from being bent back. But what that does technically is not only does it protect your fingers, but it increases the surface area that your hand, if you get your hand to a space, your hand will actually deflect the ball better because it's giving your fingers more rigidity to then deflect that ball. Like, okay, especially if it's hit really hard at you, or if you're trying to tip it over the goal. In ice hockey, we saw back in like the 90s, we saw goalies who really kind of pushed the idea of the width of equipment. Now, in field lacrosse, okay, I believe that the lacrosse goalie of the future is going to be a goalie that has basically an exoskeleton. They're not going to look like a box lacrosse goalie. They're not going to look like a field lacrosse goalie or an ice hockey goalie, but they're going to maximize the rule as much as they can with which to protect the body in a way to use more of it to make saves. Okay, so that to me is a proactive measure, right? That we're being proactive in how we use protection, not that we're being soft because we're using protection, if that makes sense. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about today, for all these goalies that all of a sudden have an onset of a fear of the ball, it's something has triggered that. Okay. Now maybe you got hit, maybe you saw somebody get hit, maybe something just came into your awareness. One thing that I wrote about in my book, in An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life, was when parents, I told the story of this mom who I'd met years ago, who every conversation with her son after a game was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you do that. Oh my God, you're crazy. Oh my God, I couldn't stand over that." The deal is that adult fears shouldn't be projected on young athletes, in so much as like we, as the adults in the room, we want to keep our athletes safe, but yet we don't necessarily want to impose on them any fears that a parent or a close relative may have, and that can happen a lot. All right, if you're just talking about your expectations about your athlete getting hurt, well, it's gonna happen. But the one concept that I talked about with the older goalies in this case was this idea of a change in values. Okay, so for athletes who, well, just hear me out here. For athletes who retire from a sport, okay, many times for the athlete that ends on a injury, right? Like they're at the end of their career and then they blow out their knee or something and then they're just kind of done. It's almost easier for an athlete in that situation to just shut it off, because they kind of feel like that they're at the end of their warranty period, and it's a great way to kind of end, right? Not that it's a great way, but you know what I mean. The idea though is also, if an athlete ends on a high note, sometimes They're like, yeah, they go out on top and they're done. But we see a lot of those athletes who then fall back into sport because they don't necessarily have something to transition to, and then they get stuck going back and back and back. Now, I did that when I retired from my Olympic career. I wasn't quite done with it. I didn't feel like I was done. I felt like I had more to prove, and the reason I stopped was I ran out of money, not because that I sucked, right? And so that can be hard. But inside sport, when you're playing, okay, and we're more aware of this than any time in history, is that athletes can have a value change, especially goalies that go out and get beat on day in and day out. I had an experience a couple years ago where um, I was working with a family who their goalie was getting probably I would equate it, I would throw it in the physically abused category in practice. And finally this goalie was just done. Like they're like, this isn't worth it anymore. And there'll be coaches and parents out there who rightfully so think that, hey, if you want to be elite at something, you've got to just persevere and power through, and you're going to have to deal with the highs and the lows, and you just got to grind it out. Uh, yes and no. We know now that that attitude can only get us so far. But what can happen for goalies is this idea that, they're just not willing to get hit anymore. And that can creep into an athlete at any age. Okay, at any age. The idea is that you have to understand that our brain is designed to protect our body, right? So if you're in the middle of a street and there's a car rushing at you, the brain is basically telling the body to get the hell out of the way. The same goes true if somebody, and I don't like to use certain examples, but if somebody yells fire all of a sudden in the house, you know that instinct is to just get up and go. You're not going to think about it. But I like to say that for goalies, you know, when we are developing goalies, we are trying to offset a hardwired self-preservation mechanism. And for a lot of goalies, they get up. When you get used to playing goal and you get used to that experience, you feel safe. Why? Because you understand it. You understand what shooters can and can't do. You understand what your protection can or can't do. Any of those things allow you to go into a situation and um, be a champion. It's the same thing as a first responder who learns how to go into a burning building, or someone who learns how to go onto like up into a car wreck and deal with people who may not be in the best in the best situation, right? So like anything, there are people who look at a situation and learn how to navigate that situation and then succeed. And then there's others though within all of it who just finally go like, I can't take this anymore. And that could be like a light switch. I can't take this anymore, never again. Or it's just a slow trickle, a slow burn where all of a sudden it's like a death by a thousandth cuts. And finally that athlete is just like, or that person's like, you know what, I'm done with this. There's other things I want to do in my life. And that can affect you as well. So for goalies specifically who end up having a situation where all of a sudden they're fearful and they didn't really have fear, what do you do in that situation? Well, the only thing you can do first is to basically back off, right? You have to back off the situation. You have to back off the intensity. You have to back off anything that might cause that trigger. Now, if a goalie gets stung by a shot and they get stung in an area, sometimes it's as easy as the goalie going like, okay, that really hurt. I'll pad up for the next practice and they're good to go. That can happen. For other goalies, though, it can be a little bit more severe because what can happen is that, let's say a goalie gets hit on the inside of the leg, right? That part is often not protected. It can be soft. I've seen athletes who are like the most fit athletes, both male and female. And there's a thing as a goalie, like if you get hit in an area, but the muscle is contracted, uh, one of the places like the calf, like the inside of the calf, if that muscle's contracted, the impact of the ball does not necessarily leave as much of an impact as if that calf is relaxed. It's kind of weird, but the idea is that for some goalies, the idea they might get hit one place, but now the brain's like, oh my God, if I get hit anywhere else, is it going to feel like that? And so now you're recovering more of a macro problem than a micro problem, like a specific injury, a specific spot, like the inside of the knee or the foot or you name it, right? So the idea here is that you have to basically back off. And the best way to do that is to increase protection, okay? But you can also move shooters back in practice. You can also use tennis balls or any sort of soft ball to basically you're going to increase time and room so that goalie can see the ball, know where it's going, and then move in front of it effectively. Or you're going to soften the ball, or you're going to pad up the goalie. That's the first thing you can do, right? But this is a building process. This won't be like, and I always tell coaches and parents, like your goalie's one shot away from basically ruining all the development that they've had, right? So you don't want to do that, right? We don't want to do that, especially in practice, okay? Because the experiences we have in games, I like to equate it, and for all the moms out there, uh, you know, when both my kids were born, our midwife told my wife that basically the pain you're going to experience is pain with a purpose. And every goalie can attest to this. It's like pain in a game is different than pain in practice. So the idea is that practice should not be a traumatic event, right? But because come game time, a goalie is willing to put some things on the line. Why? Because the reward of like making the save and winning the game is higher than the pain that's being felt. The only exception to that is that if you're a goalie and you're playing on a really crappy team, and you're like, I'm sacrificing my body for this team, and it just doesn't seem worth it. Either you don't like the team, you don't like the coach, but the bottom line is it's a value thing, right? But that's the first thing you can do is just increase protection. So that's step one. Step two is to take the goalie out of the goaltending experience for a while. Now, for some situations, you can do this. For others, you can't. Right? So if you got a game coming up Tuesday and it's Monday and your goalie got stung on Sunday, like I get it. It's a little bit of a press. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you can pad up the goalie, but if you have more time, okay, you have more time, then what I like to do is I like to get my goalie out of the cage. So one of the goalies that wrote me this last week, their words were, they've been playing goalie straight for 6 years. Okay. That is not a badge of honor, right? That is not in the whole world of long-term athlete development, of goalies in general, of athletes in general, playing the same sport over and over again for 6 years, which basically put this goalie to when they were like 8 years old. Sorry, a little bit, 10 years old. The idea is that you need other experiences to give the brain a break and also give the brain new experiences with which to have different connections, like a varied wiring of the brain. Okay, so especially if a goalie is hurt in this case, I want to get them out of the cage for a while. Let them play midfield, let them play D, let them do something else. The idea is to just freshen things up a little bit. Now, one thing to consider is also having your goalie identify as an athlete who plays the goalie position, not a goalie. So not a goalie who's playing the goalie position. So what I mean by that is that when you take that attitude towards the goaltending position, then you're part of being an athlete is understanding recovery, right? So I don't believe an athlete experiences burnout. I don't believe in the term burnout. I do believe in under recovered. So in some ways, this fear of the ball creeping in is a way. It's a way for the brain to get a break. Okay, so what happens is, and I wrote about this in my book as well, the brain will always find a way to rest and it will use a body to do so. Okay. Um, there's some great books on this. Bessel van der Kolk, Kolk, wrote a book called When the Body Keeps the Score. Um, there's also a book by Dr. Gabor Mate, Mate. um, what's the name of that book? I can't remember. But anyway, uh, but the idea is that the brain will always find a way to rest and will use the body to do so. Now, I've seen athletes who get ankle sprains. I've seen athletes who come down with some freak illness, and everybody's like, "Oh, that goalie was so unlucky." But you look back on it, you realize that there was a lot of stress leading up to that, that then caused that athlete to take a break. For these goalies, for all of them, even though they're at three separate ages, I would argue that they're all finding a way. The brain is finding a way in all of them to take a break. For that one goalie that's been playing goalie for 6 years, that goalie needs a break. For the other goalies, I didn't get deep into that question with both of them, but the idea is you have to be aware of like what's going on. Is it stress? Is it are there what other stressors are going on in this athlete in this goalie's life that is all of a sudden causing this fear of the ball to creep in? Okay, so step number one is protection. Step number two is to give this athlete a break. Step number three for the coaches and parents who are listening to this, it's reinstilling kind of an appreciation for your goalie. And this is a much more complex deal. The idea is your goalie needs to find a way to feel appreciated, but the if your coaches don't show that to you, if they're messing around with like putting other goalies in or pulling goalies or all that stuff, you know what? It, the the goalie themselves has to have like a higher goal. It's like, why are you doing this? Like, are you playing now to play on that club team this summer, or do you want to play in college? Because that's what you're working towards. You're not working towards like appreciation now. Because I always tell all my goalies, you've got to be so damn good they have to pick you. But if that's not there, if that love is not there, what happens is a goalie can just, their values can change. And it's kind of like, this isn't worth it, right? I don't want to deal with this pain anymore. I don't want to deal with this suffering anymore. I don't want to deal with the attitude or the environment. And, what is environment? It's people, places, and things, right? Maybe you don't like go to practice every day. Maybe you don't like the school you're at or the kids you're around. Maybe you don't like the coach. I get it. So any of those things can come into play. And when they do come into play, you have to figure out a way to either work through it or deal with it or detach from it. And that can very much be the case. As I'm recording this in the beginning of kind of the spring season. And for lots of kids now that play lacrosse at a higher level, meaning club and summer club, and they want to go off to college, the high school experience can be kind of crappy. Okay, not for everybody, but for a lot of places, the high school experience is not nearly as fun. It's not nearly as professional. It's not nearly as organized as the club experience can be. And part of it is like better gear, better helmets, better equipment, more fun, better kids, all that stuff. And that creates a balance issue with you know with your values. Like, okay, do I want to be around with these high school kids? Because like Jimmy, that freshman kid, he sucks. I don't like him. And or Karen over there, has never played a sport in her life, and now she's out for lacrosse, and oh my God, I can't stand her. All that stuff will weigh on your goalie. And so for some goalies, and I hate to recommend this, but I do, sometimes the high school experience is not as good as the club experience. I get it. I still want you to, I don't want you to not play high school lacrosse. But with that in mind, a lot of high school coaches need to step up their game and create a better experience for their kids. But coaching is hard, and being and showing the love to all of your players in a way that they all feel it is difficult. It's a talent in and of itself, and it's really hard. So, but people have to understand that sometimes a goalie who all of a sudden experiences fear of the ball, it has nothing to do with their protection. It has nothing to do with the durometer of the ball. It has nothing to do with with time off, and it has everything to do with the experience that they're having and the values that they're encountering, because maybe they're missing out times with their friends or their family, or any of those things. The idea is you've got to figure out what it is and go back at it. But I'll step with this. I'll finish with this. For our goalies who want to keep playing, okay, and they want to keep it going, what'll happen is by protecting themselves, by taking a bit of a break, by playing a different position for a little while, just spicing things up a little bit. I want goalies to understand that they can work through this if they follow kind of those steps. If they just try to power through, sometimes it gets you by, but also it can get you injured. When you understand that you're just kind of overriding a fear response, well, you got to understand, like, okay, if you go into a street, if you go into the street and you all of a sudden there's a car coming. Now, this is a very extreme example, but bear with me. Let's say there's a car coming and you're going to step out of the way of that car. Okay, let me give you a better example. The idea is, hold on a second. The idea is, how about this? A matador, a bullfighter. This is a better example because a lot of people can't relate to this, but they can kind of relate. When that matador first steps into a ring, they don't know, like if you step into the ring, you don't know how fast the bull moves, what the bull can do, the distance it's going to cover. You don't know any of that stuff. But for a matador who's grown up watching bullfighting their whole life, they get an appreciation of it, right? They understand the timing. They understand the movement of the bull, what the bull can and can't do. And they know when exactly to get out of the way based on what the bull is doing. That's basically what we're doing as goalies, is we're going to go into a situation and we're going to understand what's happening. We're going to understand the time, the distance. We're going to understand the what a shooter can and can't do. When the fear creeps in, we need to kind of reset that. So we got to back off and come back at it slowly so that we can get back to the point where we understand, like, hey, I've done this before. And that's why every goalie should have a hype tape, right? And then a goalie should also understand, like, hey, they can do this. They can work through this if they want. But if the values are off, if they're just like sick of it now, forget it, then that's something we want to avoid altogether by keeping a goalie fresh and recovered, and also protected and all that, and loved and all that stuff. We want that to happen. So for the goalie that's experiencing fear in their game, now all of a sudden, it takes a lot of introspection to find out what's really, really causing it. Okay, so let's work through that. If you're dealing with this now, feel free to shoot me an email. I would love to see you guys inside Lacrosse Goalie University where we can kind of talk about this more on a personal level. But the idea here is it's something that you can work through, and every goalie goes through it at a time. And for some goalies who are at the end of their career, okay, I experienced this personally where finally I was like, you know what, I'm kind of done with this. I didn't like getting hit anymore. Didn't like the competitive nature of the guys that I was playing with or the coaches that I was working with. And this was, when I was playing senior lacrosse, I just didn't like it anymore. But in a lot of ways, you can have it in at any team level, at any age. It's like, is this worth it? Yes or no? And you move accordingly. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's way longer than I was planning to go, but if you've listened this far through, do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, shoot me a comment below. You can always email me too at coachedwards@lacrossegoalietips.com. I'll see you soon.